Like many others, I've found myself captivated by the stories found in Missing 411, a series written by David Paulides and presented by many different YouTubers such as Mr. Ballin, Lord and Arts, and many others. Recently, I was watching one of my very favorite storytellers, a YouTube channel by the name of Bedtime Stories. The name of the video was Back to the Woods Addendum, and was a rare instance of a YouTube channel taking ownership of a mistake they had made in a previous video. In the video, they clarified a statement that they had made concerning Missing 411 and David Paulides, which I will show here.
We simply stated that he has a tendency to omit certain details from many of the cases he presents. Whether this is due to not having all of the information to hand, or a deliberate attempt to make some of these cases seem more mysterious than they really are, we cannot say one way or the other.
They go on to show examples of stories which Mr. Paulides had made out to be mysterious, but they are actually quite clear-cut and not mysterious at all. The cases mentioned, if you're interested, were the case of Stephanie Stewart and the death of Miles Robinson. The most startling part of all of this to me was this statement, which I will show.
Out of 40 potentials gleaned from Paulides' own books and presentations, we dropped 28 because when we looked at the publicly available information on them, we found details which Paulides had not included in his retellings.
To be clear, they state multiple times that they are not trying to criticize or slander Mr. Paulides in their video, and they are very respectful. I encourage you to take a look at the video in its entirety, which I've linked in the description below. Not only should you check up on me to make sure I'm not taking their statements out of context, but the entire Bedtime Stories channel is one of my very favorites and deserves every view that they get. My interest in this line of thought was piqued, but a search on YouTube didn't give me the results I wanted. That is, I couldn't find more information on anyone questioning the Missing 411 cases, or on Mr. Paulides' credibility in general. The point of this video is to rectify that. Today, I'd like to present some information I was able to find about Mr. Paulides, as well as an additional case which is portrayed as mysterious due to his cherry picking. When I say something that requires evidence, I'll show a number on the screen which corresponds with a source in the pastebin document linked in the description. I realize that not all of my sources are completely concrete, which is why I try to supplement with as much context and additional sources where possible. First, let's look at the man himself. There are many different versions of bios presented by Mr. Paulides and his associates, so I'll try to only cover things that are common across more than one. David Paulides claims that he has 20 years of experience in law enforcement, specifically as a detective in San Jose, California. He claims to have worked premier assignments such as street crimes, SWAT, and Vice. He retired after these 20 years because he received a job offer from a tech firm where he could make more money. This doesn't seem to be true. The timeline is a little sketchy, and some sources I saw listed the time served as 16.5 years. But that discrepancy is waved away by the first 3 being served in a different precinct. The bigger issue lies in his position and reason for leaving the department. In 1996, Mr. Paulides was charged with a misdemeanor count of falsely soliciting for a charity, which caused him to be removed from his position. His position, by the way, was not detective, but a court liaison officer. Again, is it possible that the documents say police officer, but mean detective? From what I was able to find, a court liaison is nothing like a detective, and isn't even necessarily a traditional police officer, though a court liaison unit does have one officer, according to the San Jose Police Department, so that's probably what he served as. But that's not what concerns me. What's this about being charged with fraud? From what I was able to glean from online records, Mr. Paulides allegedly used his position in San Jose PD to fraudulently solicit signed memorabilia from celebrities. That is, he pretended that there was a police hall of fame, or that he was tasked in developing a display in order to get signed pictures or other valuable items from celebrities, such as Trump. Rather than go to jail, he was allowed to leave the department and presumably pay a fine. I'm not saying that we don't all make mistakes. I'm not claiming that anybody with so much as a misdemeanor should never be trusted again. I'm just pointing out that there seems to be a discrepancy between what he claims about his past and what information is available online. Additionally, fraud is a rather unfortunate precedent to set when you're later on claiming to be an investigative journalist. In addition to this rocky start before his missing 411 career, he was a large supporter of the existence of Bigfoot. He published books on the subject, such as Tribal Bigfoot. This may or may not surprise you, as he now separates himself a little from that theory in his missing 411 work, preferring not to outright say, "It was Bigfoot," though it's so strongly inferred at points that he may as well. He was also involved with a researcher, Melba Ketchum, notice how I didn't say Dr. Ketchum, who claimed to have Bigfoot DNA. He advocated publicly to sell access to this research paper, which claimed to prove beyond a doubt that Bigfoot exists. As you may have guessed, this study was ridiculed by the scientific community, found to be flawed, and ultimately rejected as an attempt to use the press to bypass peer review. For those of you who remember the cold fusion paper a few years back, this might all sound familiar. If all of that doesn't yet give you pause for believing everything in his books, lastly, I'm going to read some Amazon reviews from his missing 411 work. I realize that simply reading reviews of a book does not constitute as evidence and may not even be interesting to some people, so you can make use of the chapters function of YouTube to just skip to the section where we look at a specific case covered in his missing 411 series. Keep in mind that these reviews are just opinions and should not be taken as facts nor as representative of how I personally feel. I've had to edit some for length, so, if you wish, please check them out in their entirety. I've included the reviews marked as most helpful from each star rating to give the full range and avoid my own bias. Consider these anecdotal at best. Up first is a 5-star review from user Stephen Bistache. 64 people marked his review as helpful. Quote, "Taken at face value as just so stories, the incidents in this book are bone-chilling. Paulides presents the facts and, almost unprecedented in books dealing with the unknown, wisely refrains from presenting an explanation or general conclusion. The nation's forests are wild and beautiful, but also deadly. The book eliminates normal disappearances and concentrates on the unknowns to devastating emotional and cognitive effect. We want to know, we need to know, what is happening, but we are not allowed to know. Not because Paulides knows and he won't tell us, but because the cases themselves are so utterly unresponsive to standard investigative methodology. Be afraid, be very afraid is pragmatic and a caveat for reading this book and its companion volumes." Close quote. Next is a very short review, 4 stars by Kashi Hawley, which 8 people marked as helpful. Quote, "It was a very interesting read. I dog-eared a lot of the stories so that I could read them again later. Would definitely recommend." Close quote. Next is a quite lengthy review. It's a 3-star rating from user Dr. Peter A. McHugh, which 12 people marked as helpful. So I've edited this for length. Quote, "Paulides submitted numerous applications for information under the USA's Freedom of Information Act, but some of the requests were not granted. He explains that the USA's National Park Service informed him that it doesn't keep logs, lists, or databases of any missing people. He suggests that maybe it doesn't want the public to know about how dangerous it is to trek alone in the backcountry of national parks. However, although his books cite many cases of people going missing in national parks, the incidents are spread over decades. Therefore, I imagine that the probability of any particular visitor mysteriously disappearing in such an area at any given time is actually quite low. Paulides attributes the significance to correspondences that others might well ascribe to prosaic factors or chance. For example, he refers to the disappearance of a 21-year-old woman in the state of Washington in 1969, and links it with the subsequent disappearance of a 22-year-old woman in proximity to where the first one had gone missing. However, he doesn't specify the actual disappearance, and he notes that the two women were close in age when they first disappeared, and they were of the same weight and height, but the second disappearance occurred 34 years after the first. In view of the way in which they were selected, I don't think that Paulides' cases can be regarded as typical. Nevertheless, assuming that he's reported the basic details reasonably accurately, he's done a service in collating these interesting accounts. As for their interpretation, I suspect that a range of different factors led to their disappearances, and that many of them, at least, if additional information were available, they might be seen to have mundane explanations. On the other hand, I don't think that we can exclude the possibility that something enigmatic or paranormal was involved in some of these cases. Close quote. We're down to the 2-star ratings now, this one from Valdemar Cavazos, which 32 people marked as helpful. Quote, "The fault lies with me for not properly looking into this book. After the rave reviews from podcasts I listened to, I purchased this book and was disappointed to find it was only case studies dryly written. It's great if that's what you're looking for, but not even looking at it from a strictly informative standpoint, I could not justify that for the price you pay. You're better off watching the Missing 411 documentaries that are available." Close quote. To give you some context of this review, at the time of writing, I believe this book is listed as over $100 on Amazon. Lastly is the longest review. Again, I've had to edit this for length. This is from user Daryl P. A 1-star review, which 80 people marked as helpful. Quote, "I guess it's my fault for not conducting due diligence on David Paulides before I purchased. Like many, I've been listening to the interviews with Paulides for about a year. On the surface, what he is saying sounds to be convincing and plausible. Then I bought this book, and pretty soon alarm bells started ringing all over the place. Most notably, I cannot accept that any self-respecting law enforcement officer would draw the conclusions that Paulides has. Also, the chilling descriptions of most cases that Paulides talks about on radio interviews are not found in this book, but rather is a list of very short statements about missing person cases that upon closer inspection, Paulides has heavily edited and quite frankly lied about. In fact, most of the content has been taken from reports and off the wall and over the edge, who have had no trouble getting these reports from the National Park Service, which have been edited by Paulides to give the impression that something mysterious is somehow going on. Even more ludicrous is the conclusions he somehow brings out from these cases. For example, Person A goes missing in 1938. Person B goes missing in 1998. For no other reason than this happened within the same 3-month period, there has to be a connection that we are not being told about. Another example is Person A goes missing in a storm in 1962. Person B goes missing in 2002. Again, for no other reason than there was bad weather on both occasions, there must be a connection to both of them. It really is that silly. Paulides conveniently forgets to mention known causes of missing persons, such as terminal burrowing or hypothermia psychosis, paradoxical undressing, and the most common of all, life insurance scams. When the official reports he produces in this book don't fit in with his criteria, he either edits out key parts of the report or he fabricates things. Close quote. Daryl goes on to post a link where Paulides and some researchers argue over his work, which I'll provide in the paste bin as well. Alright, so now we know the basic history of Mr. Paulides, as well as common criticisms of his work, as well as common praises. I'm not satisfied with just pointing out the opinions of others and the flaws of the man himself. I want to look at the cases presented with a critical eye and fact-check them to determine if, as a whole, the Missing 411 series should be taken as truthful and representative of what's actually going on in these national parks. We're looking at the Dennis Martin case in Tennessee from Missing 411, Eastern United States. First, I'll present the story without scrutiny as it appears in the Missing 411 narrative, if paraphrased a little for time and cohesion, so that I can present this in a timeline sort of format. If you'd like to hear the entire narrative, there are many YouTube channels which have already covered the Missing 411 perspective on this case. I will not, however, omit any major details presented in the book that are pertinent to the case at hand. The cited sources within the book are newspaper accounts, National Park Service documents from a Freedom of Information Act request, personal interviews, and personal experience with the area. We will start with some background of the park where Dennis went missing, so you can get a grasp of the setting. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park straddles North Carolina and Tennessee. The park spans more than 500,000 acres, split fairly evenly between the two states. There were 9 million visitors in 2008, which was the highest number of visitors of any other park. The 10 campgrounds accommodate 350,000 people annually. There are more than 2,000 miles of rivers, 300 miles of roads, 800 miles of trails, and the park employs 250 permanent employees and 100 seasonal workers. Spence Field, which is an area within the park, sits on the border of Tennessee and North Carolina and is part of the famous Appalachian Trail. The field is grassy and runs from east to west. Dennis Martin, a 6-year-old boy, was vacationing in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park with his father William Martin, grandfather Clyde Martin, and his 9-year-old brother Douglas Martin. On the night of June 13th, 1969, the family spent the night in a cabin in the Russell Field Shelter, 2 miles west of Spence Field. The next morning, they hiked to Spence Field and spent the day playing in the meadow. While the family was enjoying the scenery, another group approached and asked if their similarly aged boys could join the 2 Martin boys playing. William, of course, allowed this, and the boys began playing games together. At around 3:30 p.m., the young boys decide to split up and play some hide-and-go-seek. The game had only carried on for 3 to 5 minutes before William Martin became concerned that he had not seen where Dennis, his youngest, went. He began calling out for him, but Dennis didn't answer. Seeing this, Clyde became concerned as well and joined in calling Dennis and looking for him. They couldn't locate him, so they called for help. While the Martin family was searching, the family of Harold Key asked a group of park rangers where they could see a bear, and they were directed to an area called Sea Branch Creek, which was about 5 to 7 miles from where Dennis Martin had disappeared. Between 4:30 and 5:30 p.m., while searching for bears in the area, the Key family heard a, quote, enormous, sickening scream, close quote. The group looked around, and Mr. Key's son said that he saw a bear up ahead. After it was pointed out to him, Mr. Key was alarmed and ushered his family back to their car. He wasn't afraid of a bear, however. In a later interview, he told journalists that, quote, it wasn't a bear, it was a man hiding in some bushes. He was definitely trying to hide from us, close quote. At the time, however, the Key family didn't know anyone was missing, so they did not report their observation. At 8:30 p.m., a heavy rainstorm rolled into the park and was greatly hampering the search efforts. The rain would continue for nearly 2 weeks without letting up. The next day, on June 15th, the National Park Service personnel searched all major drainages in the area of Spence Field. 30 Boy Scouts volunteered to search, along with 51 Ranger students. Eventually, helicopters showed up with equipment to establish a base camp at Spence Field, and 2 Air Force Huey helicopters were dispatched to aid in the efforts from the U.S. Air Force. 40 Special Forces Green Berets from Fort Benning were dispatched to help as well, all within 24 hours of Dennis's disappearance. It should be of note that it is extremely rare for Special Forces to respond to a missing person's case. They also did not coordinate with the National Park Service. June 16th, a grid search of Spence Field was conducted. By this point, the search party had grown to 300 park employees, the National Guard, volunteers, and student foresters. It was at this point that the Key family found out about the missing boy and contacted the FBI with the information. June 17th to the 21st were the most intensive, and the number of searchers swelled again. Now the searchers numbered about 1,400 people. The park had to make an announcement that they didn't need any more searchers because the area was completely saturated and they could not support any more. After this announcement, the number of searchers began to fall. June 24th, the NPS had a meeting with the FBI. The nature of this meeting is undocumented, and it is unclear who called them. Nearly all the information about this meeting is absent from the NPS reports. June 26th, The Knoxville News Sentinel forwards a message received from an unknown person telling searchers to start looking in the treetops and stop looking on the ground. June 27th. The Coast Guard joins the search, looking in a nearby lake. More federal troops are requested to join the search. June 29th, at 5 p.m., a meeting with the Martins, NPS personnel, and the FBI was held. The NPS wanted to know where they should go from here. The FBI stated that without concrete evidence of a kidnapping, they could not launch a full-scale investigation, but they would leave one agent to monitor the situation. The NPS told the Martins that they were willing to continue the search for the next 2 to 3 months with 3 of their best men. After this meeting, the search and rescue operation was officially closed. A total of 13,240 man-hours were expended on the search, and more than 200 helicopter air hours. William Martin, Dennis's father, was convinced that his son was abducted, but he could not convince the FBI to get more involved. At some point, Harold Key volunteered to meet with the FBI and the NPS to describe what he saw in person, but the FBI intercepted Key and met him away from the park. The NPS felt that the area where the man was spotted was too far from where Dennis went missing, and didn't even go to the site to look. July 17th, more than a month after Dennis had disappeared, the NPS received a letter from the ESP Associates in Little Rock, Arkansas. Harold Sherman, the author of the letter, was known at the time for having some accurate premonitions. In the letter, he defined an area where Dennis may be located. The last 3 paragraphs of the letter are included in their entirety, so I feel like they are interesting enough to read. Quote, I'm impelled to ask you if you know whether there are or were any questionable characters in the region, camping out in the wild in this area, like hermits or squatters? Such an individual may not be connected to the boy's disappearance at all, but I still feel a sex maniac, so-called, does exist in the vicinity and could have trailed the boy. I hesitate to write any more as my conscious mind is trying to reject such a feeling. I see something red being carried or dragged. Are there any caves in the vicinity? A stream may even run through it or part of it. I am always tormented when impressions come to my conscious mind telling me that they couldn't possibly be true, but I get the feeling of sudden panic on the part of Dennis. What happened to him occurred suddenly, unexpectedly, and he could not or did not cry out. He seems to be struck down by something. The area is rugged. Close quote. At the time of his disappearance, Dennis was wearing a red shirt, and there are mines in the area where the Keys had seen the man. July 21st, the Knoxville Journal ran an article called, quote, Foul Play Suggested in Martin Boy Mystery, close quote, in which Harold Key was interviewed. No interviews between Mr. Key and the NPS ever took place, or at least were ever documented, and the FBI refused the Freedom of Information Act request, which makes it difficult to compare his story with his other interviews. Sometime after this, William Martin sends a letter to the FBI and NPS complaining that they were keeping information from him, that he had not heard about Key's experience from either party. Years after the search, one of the NPS rangers said in an interview that he thought a physically fit man could carry a small boy the 5 to 7 miles distance in the time required. Fast forward more than 40 years to 2011. David Paulides traveled to Tennessee to interview William Martin himself. William stated that he did not want to talk about the disappearance, as they had lived with it for so long. After some persuading, however, he agreed to answer some questions. William said that when Dennis disappeared, he was close enough to have thrown a rock and hit where Dennis was hiding. He also confirmed that he had made the hike from Spence Field to where the Key family was in about 90 minutes, proving it could be done. Mr. Martin also eventually managed to speak to Mr. Key, who, at that time, said that he had in fact seen a man running along the ridgeline with something slung over his shoulder. When asked why the newspaper had not reported this, Mr. Key said that he didn't know. The final piece of information gathered from William Martin was that the FBI agent left to observe the investigation had committed suicide. David Paulides then conducted an interview with an NPS ranger who was initially assigned to the case. The key points of this interview were that the Green Berets more or less did their own thing and did not communicate much with the NPS. He also stated that they were, quote, wild men, close quote, in the park that are dirty, hairy, and one even had an old bear skin that he wore. These men would live off the land in and around the park. He did not think that they were responsible for the disappearance of Dennis at the time, since they didn't really go into that area. Mr. Paulides notes that this is the first and only time anybody has ever mentioned wild men in the area. Dennis Martin was never found. Obviously, this is a heartbreaking case. It shows how even a brief lapse in vigilance can result in tragedy. So, before I examine what was presented in the Missing 411 book, I'd just like to take a moment to express my condolences to the Martin family. And let's not forget that this is the case of a real missing boy. A human. A child. With that said, let's move on to the examination of what was presented. If you took Mr. Paulides at his word at this point, we have a sequence of events that looks like this. Dennis Martin vanishes from an open field just a stone's throw away from his watchful father, who saw where Dennis hid. A scream is heard by a family just a few miles away. A figure is seen running with something over his shoulder by that same family. The area by the Key family is never searched and is in fact closed to searchers for 3 days. An extensive search of the field by NPS, military, and volunteers cannot locate the missing child. A psychic predicts the boy is in a cave and was abducted by a pedophile. And the lead FBI agent commits suicide. And finally, the boy is never found. Mr. Paulides makes the area where the boy disappeared sound like a grassy meadow. In fact, those are the words he used to describe the area. While Spence Field is indeed a bald, which is a type of high elevation meadow, the NPS had not maintained it since the 1930s. As such, the area was allowed to return to its natural state and was unmaintained for at least 30 years before Dennis disappeared. Granted, this is not a picture from 1969, but you see my point. This is not a clear, open pasture. Now that you're more familiar with the area, let's look at the time of the disappearance. In the original incident report, we learn 2 pieces of critical information skipped over by Mr. Paulides. First, the boys had split up in order to sneak up on and surprise the adults. Dennis went to the northwest towards the Anthony Creek trailhead, which actually supports the theory of the Key family seeing him or his abductor, since that trailhead connects the 2 regions of the park. The second and more critical piece of information is that Dennis was a special needs child. He was described as quiet and not likely to call out. Next, let's discuss the discrepancy between the initial report and the interview with Martin in 2011. In the 2011 interview, Mr. Martin said that Dennis was hiding just a stone's throw away. How could he possibly have known that when, according to the initial report and even Mr. Paulides' sources, he hadn't seen Dennis for about 5 minutes? I believe that this is an instance of confidence growing for an eyewitness report, while the accuracy decreases over time due to loss of memory, though this obviously can't be proven. I would appeal to logic, however, that the initial reports made by William Martin are more accurate than his memory is 40 years later. Let's update that sequence of events. All said, however, even though the circumstances are a little different than how they were presented in Missing 411, so far that doesn't change the outcome or possible conclusions. Let's continue looking at the reports of Harold Key. Harold Key's story changed rather dramatically between his interview with the news and his eventual meeting with William Martin. The implication is that the FBI instructed Mr. Key to alter his story. But does that really make sense? If the FBI didn't want information about a man with something over his shoulder getting out to the public, then why did they allow the Key family to talk to the press at all? If the Key family had been told not to talk to the press, but did so anyway, why would they lie? Keep in mind that the story changed over time, even according to Mr. Paulides. It went from Harold's son saying that he saw a bear in the area, which was reported to a newspaper, to Harold himself being interviewed and saying that no, it wasn't a bear, it was a man hiding in a bush, to eventually Harold's telling William Martin that it was a man running along the ridgeline with something over his shoulder. The story gets more odd and more pertinent to the case with every retelling. I now appeal to your common sense. Which is more likely? That the FBI said, yeah, you can talk to the press, but just say it was a bear or a man in a bush? Or that Harold Key found himself at the center of attention with interviews in the local news and perhaps embellished a little? And, admittedly, this is pure conjecture on my part, but perhaps he heard the psychic's prediction and changed his own story to match that of the psychic. Perhaps he didn't even do so consciously. There's a lot of research showing that memory is very fallible and very easily influenced by more information. The Key family was out there looking for bears. They wanted so badly to see a bear, they asked park rangers for directions on where they might spot one. If you're primed for that, is it unreasonable that you might think you see something, a bear or dark figure, when you actually don't? Or even if there was a bear, if it's hiding in a bush hundreds of feet away, how hard is it to misidentify it as a man or humanoid? Finally, there's the scream. That's harder to explain. Mr. Paulides himself says that the scream was reportedly too loud for a small boy to make. I can't really comment on that one way or the other. Sure, William Martin said that Dennis was unlikely to call out, but I don't think that that applies if he's being carried off or falling a distance or being attacked. All of that is speculation, of course, and the only benign explanation I can give is that perhaps it was an animal. But even at that, I'm not opposed to the idea that it is perhaps related to Dennis in some way. Let's look at the new timeline. Next up is the search. Mr. Paulides makes some claims in the Missing 411 book about how the search should be commended for its unprecedented size and scope, but says that the Cades Cove area, the area where the Key family was never searched. Both of these statements are plain untrue. The trail to Cades Cove was the very first place to be searched by park officials, since that's where Dennis was headed when he went missing. All hikers along this trail were stopped and questioned. However, this didn't happen as quickly as it is inferred in the book. Let me read this section word for word. Open quote. It was approximately 3:30 p.m., and William Martin's life was about to change forever. During the next several hours, the Martins, rangers, volunteer searchers, and various other volunteers covered every trail in the immediate area. They searched behind every plant and tree in the field. Dennis Martin had vanished. Close quote. Based on that, would it surprise you to learn that the NPS wasn't informed of the missing child until 8:30 p.m.? Clyde had to hike to the Cades Cove Ranger Station to get help, which again is along the same path that Dennis was seen going towards. This was around dusk, when the rain was beginning to roll in. What about all those volunteers being called in, and the surrounding military? Well, that's because there was no search and rescue plan in place at the time. That's right. There was no plan in existence for finding lost children in the park. It makes complete sense that they would try and get as many volunteers and extra resources as they could. Therein lies the problem. They had literally hundreds of untrained people all over the area, completely destroying whatever tracks or evidence may have been present. Next, the Special Forces. Mr. Paulides makes a big deal of their involvement, and an even bigger deal that they refused to coordinate with the searches. This is also misleading. The Special Forces were requested by the park itself, and the Special Forces later set up a communication station as well as attended and contributed to the daily strategy meetings. They even shared their plans with NPS and those present. Let's review that timeline again. We're nearly done now. Let's continue with the psychics. Missing 411 only cites a single psychic letter, though there were many psychics who called in tips and claimed to have all sorts of information concerning Dennis. I'll put some on screen now, and you can read through them. The Martin family was receptive to these, but of course none went anywhere. I mean, let's just take one more look at the letter. It asks if there were any questionable people around, then says, well, maybe they weren't involved, but maybe they are. He then mentions something red, obviously referring to Dennis's red shirt, but that was public knowledge as a description of Dennis and his clothing was distributed far and wide. Then, he predicts that a cave may be involved. Well, this would be logical as the park is known to have many caves and abandoned mines all over the place. Given the rain, it would also make sense that a lost boy would seek shelter. Then a stream may or may not be around the cave. Well, in an area with more than 2,000 miles of streams, I'd say it's pretty likely that he's at least sort of near one. This gem of a psychic then goes on to say that he did or could not cry out. Well, that's pretty obvious, or somebody would have heard him. I don't understand why he thinks that this is useful at all. Finally, the cherry on top, the area is rugged. Gee, you mean that Dennis is in a rugged area of the mountainous, wooded national park? That really narrows it down. I'm sorry for my sarcasm, but I have little patience for psychics, especially ones who give such completely worthless and vague predictions. Let's review one last time. Finally, at the end of the journey, there is only one more matter to dispute. Agent Jim Reich of the FBI, from all I can tell, did indeed commit suicide at some point. I can't, nor can anyone else, ever know the reasons why this man would take his own life. I would think, however, that investigating missing children would eventually take its toll. And that's not even considering possible personal issues, depression, or other life circumstances. I've had friends who have taken their lives, and they took all of their reasons for doing that with them. It's very unfortunate that Mr. Paulides felt it necessary to use this man's death to further his own narrative. So where does that leave us? Even though much of what's represented in the Missing 411 book seems to be inaccurate, we were able to correct some misinformation and give other things context. But we're still left with a missing child. The most likely scenario is that Dennis went out a little too far into the woods for his prank, intending to come back and scare the adults. He got turned around, chose the wrong direction to seek his family in, he got more and more lost, and one of four things happened. He bumped into a stranger who abducted and or killed him, but left behind no evidence. Maybe he ventured into a cave or mine where he met his end by misadventure or hypothermia from his light clothing and stormy conditions. He could have fallen into a water source, perhaps while getting a drink, or he fell in and got swept away by the rain-fueled rivers. Maybe he ran into a bear or other hostile wildlife and was killed and eaten. My personal belief is that he, like so many other children before him, fell victim to the inhospitable weather and succumbed to hypothermia while in a cave, crevasse, or other difficult-to-reach area that was not obvious to adults. Most of the searching took place in foggy, rainy weather and suffered from too many unskilled searchers, which destroyed tracks or paths. As I said in the beginning, I'm not accusing David Paulides of lying or intentionally omitting facts. My goal is just to point out the discrepancies between what he was able to find versus what I was able to. I hope that this video at least managed to make you think about what is presented in Missing 411 and not just accept everything at face value. These are not just spooky stories. These are missing children. Thank you for listening.